Hi everyone, thank you for the introduction and thanks Pavel for having me speak today. So I'm going to be discussing a trial I've worked on alongside Pavel and Alex. This is going to build on Alex's talk from yesterday, but I'm going to focus on the design aspect of the trial and how it's evolved over the last 18 months or so. This was my first trial working from the initial design phase, so I'm also going to discuss a bit about what I've learned along the process, particularly around adapting a trial to real-world constraints. So I'm only going to gloss over the context because Alex did a great job on it yesterday and I'm not that familiar. So yeah, this trial, it looked at different neurodegenerative diseases. So we've got 5 different disorders listed on the screen. They're all linked through common symptoms, so extremely challenging behavioral symptoms. Yeah, so the goal is to test a treatment that targets these symptoms, and to do so, we compare it to a control group, so a placebo group. So the trial was set up, as you can see on the screen here. So we have the 5 subgroups, so the 5 different diseases, and each subgroup had its own treatment arm and its own control arm. And our goal is to test the treatment effect, so the difference in the response in the treatment group and the response in the control group. Just to note, the treatment is the same across all of the different subgroups, and patients are randomly allocated to either the treatment or the control group with equal probability. So we have a total sample size of 200 patients split equally across the subgroups, so 40 in each subgroup, 20 on the control arm, 20 on the experimental arm. Now, because all of these subgroups are related through the common symptoms, this is what we refer to as a basket design. And if you know me, you know I talk a lot about these designs. So what does it involve? So it's a basket trial. You test a treatment on multiple groups of patients simultaneously, each group of patients forming what we call a basket. And a requirement is that patients across all baskets share some common trait. So in the oncology setting, this is typically a genetic mutation, but in our setting, it's the common behavioral symptoms. And basket trials, they were developed as a form of personalized medicine or precision medicine, where rather than developing a treatment for a disease type as a whole, we target it to a specific trait. So that's that common trait across all the subgroups. And this makes sense because not all patients with the same disease will respond to treatment in the same way. They won't all have the symptom that we're targeting. Yeah, so the main benefit of these designs is the trial efficiency. We can test multiple groups of patients at once, which is a lot more efficient than running separate trials for each of the separate subgroups. And it's also really important for rare diseases that typically wouldn't warrant their own investigation due to limited sample size and time and financial constraints. So we went forward with a basket trial design, and basket trials, they can look different between different trials. So Alex's initial idea was to pool all the subgroups together, which makes some sense because they all have the common symptom that we're targeting the treatment to. And it also maximizes the sample size. So we have 200 patients in one group, so 100 in the treatment arm, 100 in the control arm. And larger sample size means we have higher power. So we have a greater chance of successfully identifying an effective treatment as effective. So this is something we want to maximize, so the larger sample size is better. But what this doesn't allow us to do is make individual treatment effect estimates for each of the subgroups on the trial. We can only make an overall conclusion across all of the groups. And this isn't ideal, so say in 4 subgroups, you have that the treatment is effective, so it successfully, no, ineffective, sorry. So it doesn't manage the symptoms in those groups. But one group, so say the CBS group, has shown promise in terms of managing the symptoms. If you were to pool all of them together, you'll likely say that the treatment is ineffective across all the subgroups, and you'll miss that interesting result in the CBS group. So yeah, those patients won't get access to a treatment that is potentially beneficial for them. So what we want is a method that can still make individual estimates of the treatment effect for each of the subgroup, but can also still maximize the power. And so to do this, we use this concept known as information borrowing, where when we make an estimate of the treatment effect in one group, we borrow some information about the treatment effect in another group. And this is all kind of underpinned by the fact that they all have the common behavioral symptoms. So we're going to assume that they'll all have a similar response to the treatment. And the pooling of the subgroups, as we saw in the previous slide, that's an extreme form of information borrowing, where we completely borrow between all the groups. And at the other extreme, it's independent analysis. And what we want is kind of somewhere in the between, where we partially borrow the data based on the similarity in responses. So yeah, the advantage of this is that we still get the basket-specific estimates, but we can also improve the power. But this is a more complex design, so it's more difficult to communicate to people and a little bit more complex to implement. So like I said, the model is driven by the similarity in the data. And by that, we mean just how similar are the responses in each of the different baskets in the trial. And what we do is we group together those similar baskets and we share information between them. And then those baskets that aren't similar, we just analyze them independently. Now, this is quite a flexible structure, allowing us to both borrow and not borrow. And if you're from a statistical background, this is the exchangeability, non-exchangeability model, where a Bayesian hierarchical model is applied to borrow the information. What I haven't discussed is the trade-off. So although we get higher power and higher accuracy through this information borrowing, through borrowing between similar things, if we were then to borrow from something that is dissimilar, will introduce bias and inflation in error rates. So it's always going to be that trade-off in improving power and accuracy, but also potentially increasing the error rate. Yeah, so to control this, we can look at the strength of borrowing. The more borrowing, the bigger that trade-off is, the higher error we'll likely see, but the higher power. So this is something we really explored in this trial. We looked at different strengths of borrowing and kind of through simulation studies, we looked at the power and the error for different strengths of borrowing and picked one that kind of gave the appropriate trade-off. Now, you'd think actually the model itself here would handle that because we have this ability to not borrow within the trial, so those dissimilar baskets could be analysed independently, so we wouldn't get that error inflation, but the model isn't perfect in identifying similarity, so that trade-off still exists. So that's kind of where we left it. We had a proposed basket trial design with information borrowing, 5 baskets, 200 patients split equally, equal allocation between the control and the treatment arm. And through those simulation studies I just mentioned, we found the appropriate level of borrowing, and we found that we could get an 80% power level, so the true positive conclusions, and 3% error rate, so 3% false positive conclusions. And yeah, about a year went by, and then Alex got back in touch again, and we had our first obstacle. So Alex had access to data for, I think it was 30 months recruitment in his centre for the 5 disease groups, and he found that actually reaching 40 patients in some groups was going to be impossible in the time frame, whilst other baskets actually we could achieve more than 40 patients. And then, as I said at the start, the larger sample size, the higher power. So if we were to reduce below 40 patients, we'll have insufficient power. So we had to adapt the design accordingly. And because we now had access to the actual recruitment rates across the baskets, we kept the 200 total, but we split the sample size differently to get realistic numbers of what we could achieve. And again, we did simulation studies to examine kind of what the operating characteristics would be based on this design. Now, one thing we could do is that 2 of the baskets with the lowest recruitment actually were very similar. They had overlapping diagnostic techniques. So we just pulled all of those 2 baskets together to increase their sample size. So that left us with a 4-basket trial. Quickly after this, we hit our second obstacle, which was arguably a lot more challenging in that the placebo actually had a really high cost. And because of the financial constraints, we actually had to reduce the sample size from 200 down to 90. So more than halving our sample size, which, as you can understand, had a big impact on the power. So we had to be a bit creative of what we could do in this situation. So the first option we came up with was just to focus on 2 of the 4 baskets that had the highest recruitment. So that meant we could use the sample size that we would have used for the 2 lowest recruiting baskets on the other 2 baskets. But this obviously would mean that we can't make treatment effect estimates in all the baskets that we wanted to at the start of the study. So it wasn't great, but if it meant we had the right power, it would be okay. The second option was to increase the treatment effect size, so the difference between the experimental treatment and the control group. A larger difference between the two is easier to detect, so you need a smaller sample size to achieve the same power. So we did some simulation studies to kind of examine the effect of this. So the top row, that's the 4-basket design, and the bottom row is the 2-basket design. And then we have the power, so the true positive conclusions for the 5 baskets. And then the last column is the false positive conclusions. So that's that error. You can see the 4-basket design, the highest power we can achieve is 66%, with it as low as 61%. So we didn't really see this as a viable option, particularly as the error rate was inflated to 22%, whereas we target normally 10% and then 80% power. And the 2-basket design, we had 71 to 79% power, so better, but still below the 80% level. But our type 1 error was controlled to 11%, which is much closer to the 10%. So we went with the 2-basket design, but it wasn't ideal. But then we got some very helpful information from Alex. So he actually had information from historical data about the control arm for the 5 baskets on the trial. And this historic data came from the same center and really closely aligned with the control group in our trial. So what we could essentially do is replace some of our current control patients with this historic data. And that meant we could move some of the control patients over to the experimental arm. So this kind of fills the gap and helps with this expensive placebo group. So to adjust for this, we changed the allocation ratio. So we've got a 2-to-1 recruitment for the control arm. So 2/3 of patients to the control, 1/3 to the, the other way around. 2/3 to experimental treatment and 1/3 to the control group. So yeah, we did simulation studies again. The bottom row is that 3-basket design with the historic data. And you can see 2 of the baskets reached over the 80% power, and 1 basket had 74% power, but it did allow us to at least make some estimate within that basket, which before with the 2-basket design, we weren't able to do that. We do have slight inflation in the error rate at 14%, but again, it's that trade-off in power improvement and type 1 error control. So this is kind of our finalized design at the minute. So a 3-basket design with historic data included. So yeah, this process, like I said, it's been about an 18-month period, 2 years, something like that. So we start with coming up with a potential trial design. We simulate to determine the operating characteristics. We come up with some form of finalized trial design and model parameters. Something changes, we start again. So it's been kind of going around in circles, but not necessarily in a bad way, just kind of like part of the process. And hopefully we've come up with a finalized trial design, but who knows? So like I said, this was my first experience working on a trial from the very start, and I kind of have learned a lot so far. A lot of it's about communicating the trial design, which actually Alex was really enthusiastic from the start, so that was quite an enjoyable process. And I've also learned tweaks in the trial design are inevitable and probably never ending. And I guess one final limitation, I guess, of something we haven't considered yet was that including the historical control information. At the minute in our trial, it doesn't seem to be an issue because our control data seems to really closely aligned with the historic data. But if that was to not be the case and the historic data doesn't align, then like when we borrow between 2 dissimilar things, we can introduce error and bias. So yeah, some further simulation studies could be included to examine this. But like I said, we don't think that's going to be a huge issue in our trial. Yes, thank you.